Right, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our moderator, Susan King. She wrote for the Alverson for over 20 years. She just wrote a kind of a career retrospective on Jeff Goldblum that came out on Thursday. And yeah, take it away.
Okay, and thanks for coming out tonight. First time I was here was in 1976. I was probably a week old. Anyway, I would like to introduce the star of the movie and the director and writer, Rick Alverson, and we got Jeff Goldblum.
Hi, thank you. You're the man. Thank you for coming out, everybody. Thank you, Susan King. The great Susan King, and we're so honored to have you here, really.
I have to ask this because listening to the end of the movie, what is it about Perry Como? You have Perry Como clips, and then Perry Como, is he sort of like the antithesis of the 1950s and kind of like the faux comfort?
Oh, it's not faux. It's not faux. He's my muse. I love.
Well, no, I love.
I was reared on it.
Same here.
Yeah, and
the Gold album, the one that had the Gold album that had all the greatest hits.
yeah, and I grew up listening to him, but also he's, there's something about antiquity and modernity and this cusp of those two things and the aspiration for progress in the film. So it was like, this is a nod to nostalgia that the movie wrestles with, and it's real. It's not sort of a take on nostalgia. It's an actual sort of longing that film wrestles with, I think.
Right. And he was great. Did you grow up?
Perry Como, yeah. Why isn't this on? Wait a minute. I can do something. 1, 2, 3.
There he is.
Where the deer and the antelope play. Yeah, I knew about Perry Como. Yeah. What year was that? This is supposed to be 54. What year do you think Perry Como was around and singing?
In the early 40s. He started in the early 40s, and then It's Impossible was like 1970, 71.
70. I remember that. That was a big hit on the radio.
And his TV shows and specials were on through the 80s.
Yeah, I think that was pulled from 49 and the Perry Como Chesterfield Hour.
And then that was turned into TV. He did radio, and then he did a couple of movies.
Couple of movies?
Yeah.
What movies did you do?
Oh God, nothing very good.
Kidding,
But Perry Como in Temptation, I think, was 1945, and Hubba 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 was like 1944, 45.
How's that go?
And it was sort of like an it was a World War II song, to get you all hyped up about killing people. So
Perry's great at that.
yeah. I just always remember Eugene Levy on SCTV, and he's laying in a bed, and he has his sweater on, and he's like looking out, and he's singing Fame, and everybody's dancing around him, and he's just laying there on the bed, like sleeping. Eugene Levy's playing Perry Como, and he's singing Fame.
Fame?
Yeah.
None of the David Bowie song?
No, Fame is in the 1980 movie.
I don't know that song. But he wore a cardigan sweater. He was known for his cardigan sweaters.
Right.
And Elizabeth Warren is here, who's the costume designer for the movie.
She's not wearing a cardigan today, she's wearing a brilliant credenza sack that she made.
Yeah, she's quite a genius. But Rick Alverson is a great director, and your taste in all things visual and costumier and music seduced me horribly and inextricably. But it's true. Don't you love the music in the movie? You're a musician yourself, of course.
What do you play?
I dabble in different playgrounds, music.
And he sings, and but I love we talked about the music from the start, and and musical choices that were going to be surprising and not that, you talked about how when you do a movie like this of this era, one could pick a kind of, even trying to say the subversive things that you were trying to say, one could pick an unsurprising standard,
Yeah, it doesn't really deliver on the era. It feels like it's still in the hangover before the war, like the full sort of masquerade of newness hasn't quite set in yet for everybody, including in much of the music is pulled from it's pre-war.
The stuff you chose, what the hell is going on? Yeah, the stuff you chose finally is.
Yeah.
What was the genesis of this? Were you reading about lobotomy? Was it Freeman who was?
Yeah, I mean, it's so the film, like the character of Dr. Wallace Fiennes that Jeff plays is loosely based on Dr. Walter Freeman, who popularized and invented, for all intents and purposes, a more so-called efficient variation of a European procedure of the lobotomy, and he fell from grace in the early 50s as the procedure came under more scrutiny, and this sort of this sort of used that as an architecture and sort of built the thing off of it, and then discarded a lot of his biographical details but mostly the most interesting thing about that was for me that he hit the road, and he just was essentially moving away from his problems, which we've been doing since the inception of the nation. I mean, it's something that's deeply writ into us, just to with the kind of European restlessness to sort of blindly forge into the future and sort of discard our capacities for ramifications, and that's very much in that character, and that felt uniquely problematically American, and so that was, it was built around that.
And it's so hard to, in a way, it's so hard to imagine these days that this was very common. It was used to quiet kids. It was used to quiet fussy housewives. And it was also, the Dr. Freeman was the one who botched Rosemary Kennedy's lobotomy that her father had. They thought that would quiet her down, and it
If you know about that, yeah, you may have read about that, yes.
And I mean, it was used for everything. There was a Oscar-winning actor named Warner Baxter who was also in like 42nd Street. He was a big star for a long time. He had arthritis and he couldn't take it anymore, and he went and got a lobotomy against his doctor's wishes, and they said he didn't complain of the pain afterwards, and I don't think he complained about much of anything after that. And he was dead 6 weeks later of pneumonia.
It was more, it was sort of teetering on the idea of a cure-all, for certainly, yeah.
They used it to fix, as they thought, homosexuals, didn't they? In that period.
In female hysteria, menopausal women, two people in your family or friends could commit you, and essentially that these patients had no rights, and
I wonder what we're doing. I wonder what medical things we do now and other things we do now that when seen in another 10 or 30 or 40 or 50 years will be seen as primitive, brutal, coarse, stupid, and vulgar as that.
Well, Jeff, you worked with, as we had talked, like every great director under the sun. You have, and I forgot to mention John Micklin Silver and David Cronenberg, besides the ones we talked about. What makes Rick so special?
He's at the tippy top. He's a spectacular director. If you haven't seen his other 2 movies, I highly recommend it. Do you know his other 2 movies? What's his last movie before this? Entertainment. I love it dearly. And what's the one before that? Yeah, I love those movies. Yeah. He's very, very brilliant. I'm very lucky to be in this movie and to have met him and to have worked with him. He's fantastic. Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to embarrass you, but absolutely fantastic. Geez, from the moment we met, you know, before we started and talked about it, and I'm deeply in love. Deeply in love, yeah. I mean, what a trick to take the facts, really, we haven't talked about this much, the facts of Walter Freeman's life, and to avoid any kind of straight ahead biopic. This does much more than that, is much more ambitious than that, but to avoid that, that's a pretty good trick, don't you think so?
Yeah.
Can you imagine, you can imagine all sorts of boring, horrible, straight-ahead versions of this story? Oh boy, I would like them.
Have lobotomy will travel.
Dum 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 dum. You know what that is?
Paladin!
Yes, Half Gun Will Travel. Anybody know? Who starred in that series? Richard Boone, exactly right.
Richard Boone.
He's in one of my favorite movies.
You were mentioning it. What was it?
Yeah.
What was it?
Well, I'll give you a hint. Paul Newman was in it.
Oh, Ombre. That's right.
I love Ombre. You ever seen Ombre?
1967, Margaret.
67, Margaret directs it. Yeah.
Barbara Rush.
Yeah. He says at the end of the picture, I don't want to spoil anything, Richard Boone says to Paul Newman, "Mister, you got a lot of hard bark on you." Love it. Yeah.
And Rick, what was it like did you write this role with Jeff in mind? I mean, or was it one of those that you were saying, I just think this is something he'd be perfect for?
I mean, before Vice was brave enough to come in and get this picture made, it was, you know, just sort of, you know, just kind of hanging around the ankles of irrelevancy. I don't know. I mean, these things are difficult to get made. It was a long time sort of in the works, and you know, there's a lot of ideas to try to develop. And you know, me and Ty Sheridan had worked in my last film, Entertainment, together, and he turned 18 on that film, and he turned 21 on this film, and we got along well during the other. He you know, he had been known for Tree of Life, Mud, and Joe, and these sort of incredibly vulnerable, fragile, you know, empathic kind of characters. And I had said, oh, it would be interesting to put him in a role as an obscene clown on this existential desert road movie about comics. And he, strangely enough, was total game and stepped onto the stage and frightened us all in that movie. And so you know, he was then up for neutering much of his talent and denuding him of much of his you know, all of that empathy and all of that fragility in this, and sort of trying to make this blank slate that operated as a, you know, an unreachable protagonist. You know, he was like, let's do it. That sounds like fun. And yeah.
And then how did?
Well, then so that was early, and then you know, Jeff's the idea of Jeff came up, and it increasingly was very interesting because it does sort of, I was joking, saying, and not entirely, that it weaponizes his charisma a bit, insofar as that it you know, it teases it, and then it you know, it confronts our expectations for it, our desire for his talents, and then we sort of pull those back and make them unavailable at times, and there's a beautiful drama in that between the audience and the flat plane of the film that is really exciting, and was increasingly more exciting. And when I talked to Jeff, he was deviously up for some troublemaking in a way that really excited me, and so we you know, became friends.
When Jeff came on board, though, did the script change at all? I mean, was it kind of refashioned for Jeff, or?
I mean, Jeff's incredibly adaptable, so I mean, he sort of took, you know, he's very rigorous and curious, and does a ton of research and preparation, and it's like really dives in. So I mean, the conforming happened a lot from that side, you know. That's, you know, so that, yeah.
Jeff, did you have a chance, I mean, was there any sort of improv, or did you, like, were there a lot of takes? Did you offer various, you know, like, ways to perform a scene, you know, or you just kind of dive in with each?
Yeah, we dove in, but we rehearsed before. I mean, not rehearsed much really. We went through the whole script, you know, for hours and hours, and I had many questions and kind of acted it out from early on. But then once we got there, even though we were still, you know, both of us and together so enjoyably for me, you know, polishing it,
Yeah.
fashioning it, and changing some of it, and you know, me going, so this, I say this, he goes, yeah, maybe you don't have to say this now, you know, maybe now that we're here, don't say that, and did you say that, did something like that occur here and there?
We got tickled a lot by just removing things from the things that should be in there in a conventional film. We would just pull them out. There was a scene where where just before he calls Andy, Ty Sheridan's character, in to take a photograph, there were a lot of lines, and there was a lot of you know, explanation, and sort of it was a little maybe didactic on the page, and we just sort of had a laugh and said, you know, all you need to say is, I like pictures. And it was, you know, initially he said it twice, and it was the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. And I had to, you know, I pulled it out because I didn't want everybody to have that good of a time.
Also,
I didn't want everybody to have that good of a time.
Also, the thing is too, he's very much in control when he's visiting and doing his lobotomies, or, you know, on people when he's driving around. But in real life, you know, outside of the theater of the asylums, he's sort of a mess himself. I mean, because that must have been fun, or, well, we don't want to have too much fun, but challenging or unique to play, that he was too, you know.
Yes, yeah, it was unique, and I wanted to get it, we were trying to get it just right, but yeah, I'm often drunk and drinking and drunk and smoking that pipe. I had to learn how to smoke a pipe. I didn't know how to smoke a pipe before. Never smoked a pipe, but I did some pipe smoking before. And then, no real drinking, of course, but pretend, you know, I pretended to be drunk, and yeah.
I love those scenes because, I mean, the film, you know, asks a lot of questions about narrative, the narrative and the content, and the narrative of the where it becomes form of the film, and there's a lot of sort of this blindness that's created by Fiennes' sort of narrative of himself, and his, you know, the righteousness of the procedure, and his him sort of his justifications. But when he's not in the hospitals, his narrative falls apart. It's clouded, and it's intoxicated, and it falls apart, you know. And then in a lot of ways, the film lets it break, you know. But that's one of them.
Yeah, well, so many characters in this are in the death throes of, you know, traditional masculine role playing,
Right.
and finding it burdensome and unsustainable and grotesque, and you know.
The father, the Denis.
Denis Lafont. Oh my God.
I mean, just rewatching, you know, his speech at the end, you know, I mean, he's so kind of odd. You know, and I don't know if I'd want to have dinner with him.
Oh, you would.
I would?
You would.
Really? Is he like?
plays a lot of flutes, and he sort of dresses like he just stepped out of Krapp's last tape, and he's kind of he's a
Denis
wonderful, wonderful.
He sure is.
Wow.
And you hadn't met him before, right? You know his work. I didn't know about him. You turned me. You said, hey, so I said, what in this movie? Did I tell me more about it? Well, I've already got an idea about. You wrote that part for him, or
No, but yeah,
I'm misinformed. but anyway, but by the time I came aboard, you said, I want this guy, or this is who I'm thinking of. Yeah. And I didn't know him, and then you turned me on to Holy Motors. If you want to see more of him, Holy Motors. He stars in Holy Motors. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's fantastic, yeah. But the writing, but the ideas behind his character and what you wrote are quite
some critics sort of pass it off as a improvisational sort of ad-libbed kind of nonsense, but it's entirely scripted. Every word is incredibly rigorous. Right after this, he took off to Paris and did Beckett's Wordsworth Hoe as a 6-week production, standing stock still with a recitation for 90 minutes every night for 6 weeks. Total minimalist.
Really? I wish I would have seen that. He recited, but he was stock still, or he just, oh,
Yeah, well, his mouth moved.
His mouth.
He must have really great muscles and he must be in great condition if he could stand for 90 minutes.
105 years old.
Really? I thought maybe 103, but 105 is.
How about Udo Kier, his father at the beginning of the movie? Do you know that actor? You know that
He's been
actor, of course.
around for. But isn't it true, speaking of Udo Kier, that you did you ice skate yourself?
Yes, I did, yeah. I grew up ice skating.
So you were like a champion ice skater, or did you just?
Maybe a little much. My mom was the president of a rink in Canada, and I sort of came to consciousness at 6 years of age on the ice. You know, and then you wake up at 15 and this is your life. And I spent 6-7 hours a day at a rink until I became professional when I was 19 and taught for a few years, and then buried that part of my life.
What does professional mean? How did you, I never asked you, what did you do professionally in ice skating?
I taught.
You taught?
Coach,
At
yeah.
the same rink?
Different rinks.
Oh,
You traveled to different rinks?
you were like a pro, but you didn't perform professionally?
No, I was a teacher.
Did you wear, you didn't have any special outfits though?
This is why I don't tell people, Jeff.
I'm sorry, nor would I divulge, but you've already said it publicly, so I feel it's okay.
You told me last week that you had.
About skating?
Yeah.
But also autobiographically, I'll just divulge this, I hope you're not in the mood for it tonight, please forgive me. But that scene in the movie where his character goes into the room of the coarse fellas with whom he's working, finds all the porn or titillating girly pictures, including the hermaphrodite.
Yeah, that's essentially a reconstruction of an exact room that I went into when I was 11 years old in the basement of a rink. So, I mean, there's, it's not, the story, there's very little autobiographical about the story, but there are things that are pulled from things that I can trust, that I experienced, that I knew, that have some kind of veracity in the real world, just like the Freeman stuff, and then all of the other minutiae is sort of discarded, but, yeah.
But I was just gonna say, but it's very much, sort of like, a look at that everybody says, the 50s was the white picket fence and I like Ike, but it wasn't that way for most people. And this sort of shows kind of the underbelly of, that there were these, lobotomies and electric shocks. You know what I mean? That there was this other world to kind of keep us at bay,
I think largely too, that era is, cinematically, it's being romanticized now politically, socially, in really nefarious, problematic ways. And this sort of, an agenda, frankly, of the film is to de-romanticize it to some degree. But cinematically too, it's always romanticizing that idea of the white picket fence. Even in, the contributions to uncovering some of the unseemly, sort of hidden nature of that era are oftentimes, saturated with deep, dramatic, emotive performances, and are still a kind of cinematic, there's a romance with it, that era still. And so, the film tries to remove that and make us confront it our access to that era is impossible. We only have the echoes of it. And so, it's the film kind of tries to become formal and a little, opaque to emphasize that, I think.
Douglas Sirk looked at, I'm sure you were meaning about saturated and, the performances, but Douglas Sirk they were gorgeous films and melodramatic, but it was turning a look at the 50s and, you know, what was going on and, you know, class struggle and, you know, it was.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredibly vital, but it doesn't, I mean, there's a trend and a tendency in cinema to just keep like recycling and pointing to past cinema and the nostalgia of that, and it becomes this strange sort of feedback loop of self-referential justification and like just, it's, I don't know, I mean, it's the effort at confronting it in a new way is difficult in that. And, you know, there's something very validating about all that too, and that feels a little disposable in this day and age. You know.
What filmmakers, you know, when you weren't ice skating, I mean, what filmmakers, what filmmakers did you admire?
I mean, I was early on a big Tarkovsky and Bergman, sort of like that's what pulled me out of the, you know, all of the intoxicating consumer sort of seen by the 80s, were first seeing Stalker and then discovering Bresson, and you know, they felt like in Cassavetes and the sort of like restlessness that I had after watching those things, and the echo and the potency and the possibility of it changing my perception of the world rather than just, you know, numbing me for, you know, an hour and a half, or, you know, and in a more contemporary sense. I mean, I'm you know, that era of the French extreme sort of cinema, and then, you know, Haneke and Claire Denis and Verlat,
About Lemoore.
Who else? I forgot. Who else?
Claire Denis and Catherine Verlat, and you know, yeah.
And I just got
Bruno Dumont.
Bruno Dumont. Anybody know Bruno Dumont? You've been talking about him. I haven't seen the movies of Bruno Dumont, and I must. I know. Bruno Dumont. Really? I'm gonna. I've heard about Tarkovsky, about Stalker all my life, but it wasn't until we started work together that I said, "Oh, okay, I've got to see it." And I saw Stalker. Wow, that's really something.
And you still need to get the Criterion. You need to get the Criterion show.
Okay, I know. Well, I was stuck on that Filmstruck thing. I love
Right.
Filmstruck, and then it went out of business. But I haven't.
No, but you'll like the Criterion show. And I have gotten.
No, we must.
Yes, no, I've gotten. I've gotten it's over.
One question, can we take one question?
Happy trails to you.
Questions? No questions?
One?
Can we do one?
A signal
Next
on
show's in 10
sometime?
minutes.
Oh, wow.
One quickie.
One through a speed round.
That, the scene early on where they were in the car and he says, "Did you know my mother?" It was outside a big gray building. What building was that? It looked like Syracuse University or something. Was that in Syracuse?
Oh, yeah, that's Syracuse. I love the idea of a university being a mental hospital.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't know exactly what it is.
We found this location. I love it. We visited a bunch of old, you know, rundown institution kind of things. Yeah. Love those.
Apparently we have to run so that other folks can.
Honorable. Thank you
Another
so
show
much.
coming.
Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
So that's